It's those moments that obviously they're on the schedule. You can plan for many of those acts, but sometimes they're more unexpected. And I remember when I first heard the Voices of Liberty, and that was kind of my exposure to not only some classic American songs, but also just the notion of a cappella. I love those moments in the parks. They may not get as much attention, but they certainly make them more magical experiences, because I think the thread line here is that music is evocative. It makes us feel very strong feelings because it can take us to different parts of our lives or even expose us to new ideas and themes. So for me, it's those musical acts throughout the parks that are maybe not in a huge theater or get a ton of attention, but ultimately make the Disney theme park experience special.
That is Brett Nachman of the Notably Disney podcast, who is here to talk with me about a lot of great composers of music from Walt Disney World, Disneyland, and a lot more. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 128 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. Hope you're all hanging in there as we roll through January. I'm glad to hear that some of you are getting vaccinated as that slowly moves through all of us, even possibly at Disneyland, which I think is a really fun touch and could be very helpful for a lot of people. I'm really excited about today's guest. I talked with Brett Nachman of the Notably Disney podcast. Brett does a show that's often an interview show like mine, where he talks to composers, authors, just a lot of smart people that have been directly involved in Disney and covering Disney. And Brett's focus is really on books, but also music. And that fits with today's episode, where Brett and I are going to do something a bit different. I am a big fan of fantasy sports, so I find myself involved in a lot of drafts where I'm trying to figure out the best players that I should choose. And it's sort of like that here, though I would not say best. I would just say Brett and I are going to choose some of the most noteworthy and impactful composers of music for the Disney parks, especially Walt Disney World and Disneyland. We're going to go back and forth. Each of us are going to choose 5. And then just for fun, I'm even going to post a poll on my Facebook and Twitter pages where you can go out there and choose who got the better team. And this is totally for fun, not designed to say one is better than the other. Just a different way to spotlight a lot of the music we really love from the parks. So I really enjoyed talking to Brett, and he had a lot of great choices and good points about some of the music in the parks that we love from both the past and from the present. So there were too many choices for us to possibly pick, so I made sure and listed some honorable mentions at the end. But I think you're going to enjoy this show, especially if you're into Disney Parks music. Before I get to Brett, I want to mention a few quick things. First of all, I actually was a guest recently on Brett's show, Notably Disney, alongside Len Testa. This was not designed. We actually recorded this a little while back. It just happened to be that the first part of the long episode with Len and I was released last week, and the second part is releasing this week. Len and I both focus on some of our favorite books that cover the Disney parks, and you also have Brett giving his picks. So it was so much fun, but it ended up being quite lengthy, so I understand why it was split into 2 episodes. But if you're looking for some recommendations as we roll into this year for some great books covering the parks, all types of them, more guidebooks, biographies, books about Imagineering, there's a lot of good ones from Len and Brett, and at least a few from me too. Easiest way to find that, you can go to tomorrowsociety.com/Brett, B-R-E-T-T. That will take you right to the episode. I also want to say thank you to the latest member of the Tomorrow Society, Paul Lane. Paul, thanks for helping to support this show. I also wanted to mention Paul wrote a book recently, which is called It All Started with a Blog Detangling the Wide Web of Disney Bloggers. He interviewed a bunch of bloggers and podcasters that cover Disney, including me, though I think it's an interesting book, even with me being involved. But there's a lot of familiar names, whether it's Lou Mangello, Matt and Nate Parrish, so many others that are covered in this book. And I think it's definitely worth your time if you enjoy Disney podcasts and Disney blogs. One more quick thing before I get to Brett. I am doing an episode in late February, all focused on my ideas for ways to possibly improve Tomorrowland at Disneyland. Similar to my shows about Epcot last summer, I would like to get your input. So send me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, message on Twitter, Tomorrow SOC, Facebook, Tomorrow Society, Instagram, Tomorrow Society. And if you want to record an MP3, do that and I will play it on the show. Keep those around 2 minutes or less. I'm going to give my ideas, but I want a good portion of the show to be your thoughts. I've already received some really cool ideas. Submit your thoughts about Tomorrowland at Disneyland by February 10th. It's going to be a lot of fun. So that was a lot of housekeeping. I want to get to the main part of this episode. Let's do it. Here is Brett Nachman. All right, I'm excited to be here with the host of Notably Disney, an awesome podcast where he talks about Disney music, books, and a lot more from Disney's parks and films. His many great guests have included Don Hahn, Bruce Broughton, Alden Fitzgerald White, so many more. It is Brett Nachman. Brett, thanks so much for talking with me here on the podcast.
Thanks for the invitation to be here, Dan. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Oh, yeah, I've really enjoyed being on your show. And I'm excited because I know you're really an expert on Disney music. So I thought, I want to focus on the music from the parks. You'd be the perfect person to talk with. In a little bit, Brett and I are going to do a draft of various Disney composers from the parks, really just as a way to spotlight some really great composers. But before that, Brett, I'd love to know for you, I really don't know that much about your backstory and how you got interested in Disney and everything. So I'd love to know, how did you get originally interested in Disney and in the parks in general?
Yeah, well, I think my story probably models that of a lot of other folks in the Disney community, visiting the theme parks as a young child, watching the movies, for me on VHS tapes. And that passion for Disney really emerged during those very formative years. For me, it was being enchanted by films like The Lion King, Toy Story, most importantly, visiting Disneyland in 1996. I was 4 at the time, and the park was definitely experiencing a lot of changes as it kind of neared the end of the decade. I was just ultimately very enchanted with the characters, the music, the overall sentiments associated with the company, and that fostered just a humongous passion, so much so that most gifts during the holidays or my birthday related to Disney of some sort. And I just had a passion for kind of translating that to different aspects of my life. So certainly, visiting the parks on vacation, attending Disney on Broadway at a young age, seeing Beauty and the Beast, and certainly having a lot of Disney merchandise, as I mentioned. And then as I entered my adult years, my background actually was originally in journalism. My undergrad's in journalism. So what was really cool during those years, I wrote for an entertainment website, actually a couple of them, and had a Disney column. So over, I think, about a 7-year period, I wrote for one website was called fusedfilm.com. Another one is still running, and it's a great platform. It's called geeksofdoom.com. And I use that as an opportunity to really translate that love of Disney to different audiences, covering everything from movie reviews to top 10 lists. And it was a nice way of uniting my passion for writing and my curiosity and fandom as it pertained to Disney. And then over more recent years, while my career in journalism was limited, more formally to when I was an undergrad, I'm an education researcher today, and a big passion of mine is just to learn for a living. That's really what I do, and constantly reading and writing, and often during that time is when I actually listen to Disney scores in the background. So over the past few years, I've had my own Disney podcast, and it's been a really nice mechanism for bringing that love of Disney and actually journalism to some degree to a new type of audience and a new space. I've loved podcasts ever since I was a kid, and now it's cool to be in that community and interviewing both well-known figures who have worked for Disney and folks like you, Dan, who are great Disney podcasters and who are helping tell these folks' stories.
Well, excellent. Yeah. And I also have a background in journalism. So there's something about being in journalism and then not really doing that and then becoming a podcaster. I don't know what the Venn diagram is for that, Brett, but it's interesting for me just because your show, what I really enjoy about it is you do really good interviews. And there's also, I can tell that you mentioned learning, that you have that kind of education side, because the kind of questions you ask are really, they sound like somebody who researches and is in school and does kind of that side of it. So you're doing all of that, but then what kind of made you mentioned what you've done with writing and everything, but what excited you about then taking that research and then trying to kind of put it in, because podcasts are a little different. Mm-hmm. How did you kind of decide to do that in this medium?
Yeah, well, I think it all comes down to challenging myself as an individual. And for me, writing comes very naturally. It's what I do for a living, and I communicate in different spaces for different audiences. However, not necessarily engaging in that in an audio space. That was something new and unique and interesting. So it's one thing to be a consumer of podcasts and radio. It's another to be on the complete flip side of it and to be an active participant in actually shaping the programming that's out there. And certainly, as well as anybody that there are so many different podcasts out there, and certainly in the Disney space, it can feel a little bit even just oversaturated. There's just so much stuff, and at least I asked myself, okay, what am I going to bring that's different to the space? Because certainly there's a lot of great podcasts related to the parks or particular spaces. What I've always loved about the Tomorrow Society podcast is just the great interviews with folks across different aspects of the company. And so for me, it was figuring out, okay, what's kind of my niche? And I believe it was only Book of the Mouse Club that focused on Disney books. And there hasn't been anything consistent, at least that I've noticed, that has really focused on Disney music. And so my love of communication and how that manifests both in music and the written form via books seemed like a perfect blend. So notably, Disney kind of emerged as a mechanism for uniting these passions and challenging myself in continuing to conduct interviews, but with different folks, not necessarily research participants for my educational studies, but rather going back to those earlier days of talking with folks who are for instance being in the entertainment industry or in media. And consequently, over these past 2 years, it's been a real blast to be able to connect with just wonderful people, both names I had been familiar with for many years, and also those who are, I think, more undiscovered in the Disney community. So it's been a huge blessing and wonderful opportunity for myself, and really tapping into that thirst for knowledge, especially when it comes to Disney.
Yeah, totally. And I think you mentioned too, like I totally ran into this when I was starting my show, like the Disney space just being so full and just so many people that are at the parks constantly or whatever. But I think you've been able to, especially with the music, even more than I have. You have such a background. I can tell you know the music so well, much more with the films too, that I think you've carved out a really good, I don't even want to say niche, but a good corner where you're doing something different. And I suspect a few of the people you've talked with may show up when we draft our composers here, because you've talked to some really heavy hitters that have done a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, it's been really remarkable, and you hear these names, you are familiar with their work, and I know you are too, and to have the opportunity to talk with them feels like just an incredible privilege. And I think my philosophy is there's a lot of resources that many of us possess in life, but one thing that is perhaps most valuable is time, and to be able to have 30 minutes or an hour, sometimes much longer, with most anybody really, whether they're an Oscar-nominated composer or a fellow Disney fan, is really a treat. So I see that as quite a wonderful thing, and hopefully tell some stories that, or share some stories, I should say, that hadn't really surfaced until them being asked certain questions. So it's a cool platform for me.
Excellent. Well, yeah, you've already had a few guests. I mentioned Alton Fitzgerald White, where after he was on, I read his book and was like, wow, this is great. And there's been others like that too. So let's do it. Let's dive in now to, I've stalled enough before I can actually fail at this, but what I was thinking is I wanted to spotlight composers from the parks. And I know you also focus on movies, but I admit I'm not as much of an expert on the music from the movies. But I think it'd be fun to, instead of just you and I listing like our top 5 or top 10 or whatever, I thought it would be fun for us to draft something. I'm a big fantasy sports player, so drafting to me is a very normal thing. But basically the idea being that we're just going to rotate back and forth and select composers. And I've told Brett beforehand, do not feel pressure here to make the perfect selection. These are just composers that we really like their work, and they've done something for the parks. And so I thought we're going to each select 5. And basically at the end, I may throw in some honorable mentions and others that I think have done great work. And just to spotlight a few of them, I'm sure all of you know, maybe a few others you don't. I learned a lot just getting ready. So Brett, are you ready to do this composers draft?
Oh, I am so thrilled and set.
Okay.
Let's do this.
Well, you are the guest. So I am going to, this is dangerous because you may pick the one that I would pick, but I'm going to let you pick first. So Brett, who would be your first choice for a composer? And I would say too, there may be a situation where there is more than one if someone is possibly a family member of someone else. But I will say your first composer.
Okay. No pressure. Well, I definitely want to just recognize that that there were so many different composers to think of here, because we're talking about the parks and the legacies of attractions and spaces, and I couldn't think of anybody that more represents Disney music in the parks over the most number of decades that I could think of than Buddy Baker. So Buddy Baker is probably one of the most prolific Disney musicians of all time, maybe even more so than the Sherman Brothers and Alan Menken. His music encompasses both the films and the parks. And when I think of the parks, I think of Buddy Baker because his attractions, whether they are extinct or even enduring and have existed for decades, really epitomize that Disney theme park sound. They are catchy pieces of music. They are ones that I would say you tend to hum to throughout your day visiting the different Disney theme parks, and ultimately has just a rich sensibility to it. So whether I think of something like, for instance, the Haunted Mansion. Haunted Mansion, exists across the various Magic Kingdoms, and that score is just absolutely magnetic. It's ethereal, it's rich, it captures the mood. But Haunted Mansion has been around for decades, but you might have an attraction like Adventure Through Inner Space, which I never experienced for myself. It closed, I think, in 85 or 86. And yet I own the musical history of Disneyland CD set from the 50th anniversary of Disneyland. And it's one of those tracks that I find to be absolutely mesmerizing because of Baker's really eerie and almost just scientific, maddening sound. It's hard to quite capture. I could go on and on about Buddy Baker, and I'd certainly welcome your thoughts, but I think it's just really important to recognize this is an individual whose legacy of Disney attractions, it's not just the old days of Disneyland or even some of the earlier Epcot work, but even up until just right prior to his passing, he actually composed music for Tokyo Disney Sea via the Journey to the Center of the Earth attraction. which opened back in 2001. So encompassing multiple decades, many decades, and really emphasizing that sense of a Disney park sound, which is catchy, it's memorable, it's transportive, and ultimately palpable. Buddy Baker fits the bill.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Buddy Baker was one that today, like I've known him a lot through his work for Epcot, where he was basically the person who led the music. Even when he didn't write the songs, he was involved in everything, and then was more closely involved with like It's Fun to Be Free and Kitchen Cabaret, and especially Impressions of France, which I love that score. It's amazing. But yeah, you look at his list of credits, like you mentioned, and it's just incredible. I mean, he did work for the 64 World's Fair, like Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. He did If You Had Wings, the music. A lot of these were written by Exitensio, but he did the music for it. Or just Universe of Energy, worked on American Adventure, so much more. And I feel like, obviously there are others that had a big role, but I grew up going to Epcot Center, and that music was so important to me. When I think of my favorite Disney songs, so many of them come from that early Future World. And he was involved with so many, and either directly or indirectly, that he's super important. And plus did a lot with Disney films too. Before that, his legacy is incredible.
So Dan, you were mentioning Buddy's film work, and it makes me think of how so much of his film compositions actually manifested in the theme parks. So, for instance, like the Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh attraction, which he, composed the score for. There's some really unique musical elements in his scores too. So, like I think of Heffalumps and Woozles and that iconic scene both in the film and the attraction, and he incorporates some really cool instrumentation, like the kazoos. Like you don't often hear kazoos in a score, but you know what? There's an example of that. So there's often a level of playfulness too that was a really signature element.
It's great. Yeah, even you mentioned earlier Adventures Through Inner Space. Like I wrote that once, though I was like, it was 1985. It was right before it closed. And only thing I remember is being really freaked out to think I was actually going to be shrunk. But I've heard that song music a lot. Like you mentioned, that 50th anniversary box set, it's incredible. And there's a lot of whimsy to that too. And the Swiss of Polka is another good example that he worked on, which has that same kind of, I wouldn't say kazoo, but that whole same side of it, that fun side. So we could probably do a whole show on Buddy Baker, and I think I could say that about most. But I guess we should move on now, Brett, to my first choice, which actually I thought you were going to make this choice, that I was going to take Buddy Baker, but you took him. So now I'm going to flip it around. And it's a really obvious pick. But to me, I feel like we should spotlight the Sherman Brothers here, because they are, so many classic Disney songs at movies and beyond. There's a Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow is still one of my favorite songs for the parks or anywhere really. And then Tiki Room, Small World, One Little Spark. What really gets me about them too is that they really have the way to like embody an attraction and even embody kind of the mood of the park. Like if you think about One Little Spark, to me, that almost embodies the whimsy of early Epcot and not just the Imagination Pavilion, or even just, they did Miracles for Molecules. We mentioned Adventure Through Into Space again, or It's a Small World, where that song I know gets a bad rap, but that song really drives that whole attraction. That attraction doesn't work without the song. Or, Tiki Room, same way, where it's like they have just, at their best, find a way to just embody what Disney is. And really what Disney is, a lot of it comes from them, whether it's Mary Poppins or them doing, even other attractions. So they were, Winnie the Pooh we mentioned again, but going back to the 64 World's Fair, they wrote Get the Feel of the Wheel of Ford, which totally fits with that attraction. It's a bit much, but they just have this way of being able to kind of have this idealism and corniness a bit, but charm, and just being able to kind of take a very simple phrase and melody and turn it into something just incredible. And I think that they deserve all the credit they get for their influence on both the parks and the films.
So I love the Sherman Brothers as well, and I think we're all forever grateful that they've had such a profound impact on all aspects of Disney, and really representing not only what a Disney song catchy Disney song sounds like, but also having that really positive impact in the parks, those pieces of music that are forever ingrained in our minds and souls for the better. I also think of just even at times just oddness and ethereal aspects of their music. So not that I experienced it firsthand, but the Magic Journey song from the Imagination Pavilion, which has been interpreted in different ways over the years. That's a very mesmerizing yet creepy song all at once. And if we're talking really about the score, it's both soothing and haunting at the same time. So the Sherman Brothers are just incredible individuals.
Yeah, Magic Journeys, seeing that as an 8-year-old in 3D, oh boy, that's a creepy show. YouTube does not do justice to how creepy that show, and a lot of it is the music. You add that music in, and there's like this giant guy on stilts and a witch in the moon, and the witch is laughing, and Brett, you did not miss out as far as if you're an easily scared kid. That was not the one to see, but their music was amazing in it. And Making Memories, the pre-show, which they also did, which totally kind of made Kodak seem very whimsical and fun.
Yeah, it seems like a counterpoint to the attraction, right? To have both of those in the same building, really.
Totally. All right, Brett. Well, what are you going to pick next?
Sure. Well, I'm going to stick with the double Bs and go with another individual whose music I have loved ever since I was a kid and who I was really fortunate to have interviewed. You have two, Dan. I'm talking about Bruce Broughton, who I think has delivered some of Epcot's best music, some of the most evocative scores that I've heard in the parks. I first became familiar with him via the Homeward Bound films from the 90s, and then later visiting Epcot and experiencing the really just immersive attractions like Ellen's Energy Adventure, Honey, I Shrunk the Audience, The Making of Me, which was at the Wonders of Life, The Timekeeper. These are scores that are at times very just enthusiastic and pompous in their flair and magnitude, and that's just really by virtue of the great orchestration. But some of his scores have also been quite poignant. I think of the Golden Dreams score from Disney California Adventure. That was the Whoopi Goldberg Story of California film. That was just very moving. Broughton has these really lovely themes, generally even sometimes multiple themes across each attraction that he has provided the scores for. And I'm forever in love with them. Talking with him was such a thrill. And for someone who would do everything possible in the earlier days of the internet to find examples of his music, it was quite the undertaking. Before YouTube, if we can remember days before that, I searched really hard to find just different examples of like Ellen's Energy Adventure, which was a favorite attraction score of mine because of its grandeur and catchy theme and just general excitement. So, now music is much more accessible. We can, play it on very easily, but that hasn't always been the case. And I think back to those early days of using the internet and trying to find Bruce Broughton music, even if I wasn't initially familiar with his name, I sure was with his scores, and then to be able to attach the two and make sense of the great body of work. It's amazing. And more recently, we've heard it through his responsibility and extending the majesty of Jerry Goldsmith's score for Soarin' via Soarin' Around the World. Rarely have I ever cried in a Disney attraction, but when I saw and experienced and heard his new interpretation and score for Soarin' Around the World, I was in tears because it did its justice, and I'm really forever pleased that Bruce Broughton's work is part of my music library, and to have communicated with him for a bit too.
Such a nice guy too. Like I talked to him really
Yes.
early on, really laid back. It was just like I emailed him and he's like, "Sure, I'll come on." And I was like, "Really?" So, okay, because he's done so much. I mean, Silverado has a really great score as kind of the retro western from the 80s, and then Spaceship Earth too, which you could say what you want about some parts of the new Spaceship Earth, but the score is amazing. I feel like the new score is so well done and interesting, and his work on that is something. And also one other thing, Cinemagique, which I went to Paris when that was still playing, and that's an amazing show, love letter to the movies, and his music for that is something that's also really special. There's just so much warmth to his, like, Making of Me. I mean, that's something that could have gone wrong in so many different ways, but there's so much warmth to that show, and a lot of it is from his music, which makes it have the right tone, which is very tricky for a show like that.
Oh, absolutely. And, I also think, you mentioned Spaceship Earth a minute ago. I think how, and such an undertaking where you're having the duty of really communicating music across different points in time. And so you have to convey that in the instruments that you select and just capturing that right feeling. One of my favorite parts of that score is with the more modern era. I think it's about 8 minutes into the soundtrack, if you can find that online, and it's very frenzied with lots of strings and brass to convey the sudden rush of technology. And Bruce is awesome in that space too. I love just the grandeur of some of his scores. And then, like you said, Making of Me, so sentimental, so sweet. There's a bit of zaniness, of course, but it's just undeniably heartfelt. And that's why he was often, selected to compose scores for family films, because he has that sensibility.
Totally. Yeah. He's done so much for the Disney parks, especially like in the Eisner and later era, and just for movies, and even just did the Orville fairly recently, the show with Seth MacFarlane. So he's still done some work recently, and just a real pro. So let's move on to my next pick, which I'm going back to, again, someone who did a lot with Epcot and essentially was Buddy Baker's protege in a way, which is George Wilkins. George was basically the composer in residence essentially after Buddy Baker. I don't know the exact chronology, but is known the most for New Horizons, which of course is one of my favorite songs at any Disney park. But that's just one part of what he's done. As I dug into more, he's done a lot. He did the Space Mountain cue music in the mid-'80s with the Starfield and with the do and that whole part, which is so great. And then music for Living with the Land, The Living Seas, Country Bears, Vacation Hoedown, and Christmas Special. Also did Sunny Eclipse music. Buzz Lightyear was involved with that. So much. And then other things that have a different reputation, like Enchanted Tiki Room under new management, Superstar Limo, the original Test Track music. But regardless, just for New Horizons right there, to me, that's one of the great songs that embodies, again, I mentioned what I love about Epcot Center. That song and that attraction did so much. But then when you add in a wide range of genres, like I mentioned, Country Bears and Bugs and Tiki Room is kind of one area. And then you have this like futuristic space-like music in the other. And he's able to do both and I bet you that there are plenty of things that I didn't uncover that he worked on just being in residence for so long in the 80s and 90s that his career is impressive. And I also don't feel like he gets as much credit because he's, a lot of the things he's involved with either aren't there anymore or just are kind of playing in the background. And it's different than someone like the Sherman Brothers or even Bruce Broughton, but he's done a lot for the Disney parks.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more, Dan. George Wilkins, my gosh, I like you, I love the Horizons music. Another example, I may not have experienced it firsthand, but I've listened to it enough times to feel like I was actually there. And there's so many scenes and interpretations of the New Horizons song that are just they capture my attention. And I've gone on YouTube at times and listened to like 1 hour loops of a 3 minute piece of music from that, just on repeat, because I just find it so calming and serene. Do you have a favorite like scene from Horizons that kind of illustrates George Wilkins' music?
It's interesting. Actually, with the music, I think what really stands out to me the most, not as much from the attraction, but when you walk in the doors. Because what it was is you would walk in at the time, like automatic doors, like, whoa, automatic doors, hey. But basically you go through and you walk down the queue and the music, that song is playing in the queue. So it's like that. So you're walking by and then there's these kind of futuristic images of the three different types, space, desert, and the sea that you see. And you're walking through and it just sets the mood so perfectly that when you walk in and it's like, if you can dream it and we can, I should not sing for anyone, but basically that song is playing and yes, we can. And it's like, oh yeah, we can. And then you haven't even gotten on the ride vehicles yet. So I think, there's music throughout, but I feel like just right off the bat, having that version with the kids and everything, it totally hits. It might seem a little like, not being there at the time, some people might be like, oh, this is a little obvious or cheesy or whatever. It totally works when it's in the context of the attraction.
Well, and my interpretation, not having written it, but familiar with the music, is that it's quintessential Epcot. It's that spirit of optimism, and it's illustrated not only the themes of the attraction and certainly what the park and original Community of Tomorrow represented, but also in just the music, where it's bright but not sappy, where it's energetic but not frenetic, and I think that quality of Wilkins just is beautiful. And even in some of the like funky piece of music, I know you mentioned Sunny Eclipse. Also, but the Buzz Lightyear Space Ranger spin has some like really odd interpretations of strange things, but I love it. So that's really a credit to Wilkins in making something that we're familiar with a little bit, or a lot if we've watched Toy Story a million times like me, but having an inventive new flavor. So that's a real testament to his ability to make music fun.
Yeah, and there's it's really easy to find, especially if you have even like Spotify or something or YouTube, his Buzz Lightyear's clip, like not the Galactic Anthem, but the one that's like 6 minutes it's on one of the official Disney music compilations, is
Sure.
really interesting. I listened to that today and I'm like, I don't really remember hearing this in the attraction, but it sets the mood really well. And I'm sure it's in there. It's just not that march that you have at the beginning. All right, well, let's move on, Brett. What is your third choice?
Oh, this is getting hard, Dan. Like this is intense stuff here. I'm gonna go with another composer whose work is found across many parks over many decades, and I'd like to highlight Richard Bellis, who again, someone who I know we've both interviewed and really enjoyed talking with. He really first came onto the Disney park scene back in the 80s when he was working on some stuff for Epcot, and really importantly, translating some scores that we're familiar with, or rather arranging them in new ways for the parks. So properties like Star Wars and Indiana Jones, which were not officially in the Disney family, but this was many decades before the Lucasfilm acquisition, but we were seeing those properties present themselves in the theme parks. And yes, you would hear certain cues from the John Williams scores, but Richard Bellis had the really great opportunity in not only arranging them in new ways, but also creating his own scores. So I think of the Star Tours cue and those iconic chimes that are forever ingrained in my head, and I think make for the best ringtone ever if anybody has that set. But also even more recently with Lights, Motor, Action, which was, I feel like, really dynamic, action-packed score at Disney's Hollywood Studios. He's not only is he a great composer, but very kind and generous and genuine. Love talking with him. And you can tell that he has fun with his music. The buoyant score for Grand Fiesta Tour in Mexico is illustrative of that just wonderful, authentic joy of capturing the flavors of Mexico. Richard Bellis is just an absolutely great composer. I've enjoyed the attractions that I've mentioned, also to his work for Dinosaur, the Captain EO pre-show, Twilight Zone Tower of Terror. That can be both haunting and mesmerizing. So, when I think of Disney parks, obviously all the people we've talked about come to mind, and so does Richard Bellis, because his impact has been really profound, especially in making the music that we're familiar with via Star Wars, but even more enjoyable because he kind of breathed new life into it via Star Tours, via that queue, and so much more.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, Richard has done so many things, and I think it's a really undervalued skill to be able to take music like from the Twilight Zone or John Williams or something. And like his story, he said on your podcast about even the Indiana Jones Stunt Spectacular and the timing they had to do to match up with the action, and they kept changing. And some of the skills involved that are required for a theme park, which are so different than a movie, and he gets into so well. And also I should mention some of his work on Reflections of China. That is a beautiful track that kind of takes from what was done for Wonders of China and the Chinese composer and then arranges it. And then, yeah, I love that Countdown to Extinction / Dinosaur theme. And it's one that you barely hear in the ride itself, but it's on official Disney Parks music, and it's just so well done. And he's done a lot. And also, like you mentioned, a lot of different things that just while being there for that long, it was an arranger for Epcot, did so much, did Alien Encounter songs. I mean, just a lot of different things and a lot of different genres, and found it all to work really well.
Absolutely. And I also just want to point out before I forget, because I think listeners might be interested in checking this out on YouTube. He actually created some music that would have been used for the Circle of Life film at Epcot, what ultimately became the Lion King telling of how we should respect our environment. He created an original score for it before it ultimately became Circle of Life, and there's audio of that on YouTube if you just type that in. And I incorporated a clip into my episode with him. But he was told at the time, or many years later, I should say, that was. So many people were just so upset that it didn't manifest in the attraction, because it's some of his best work, and I would agree. It's extremely evocative. It has that African flair at times, but it's really grand and impactful. So I'd really highly encourage folks check that out, because it's just some forgotten Disney music that never saw the light of day, but it's really quite great.
That's interesting too, because I have not heard that yet, but I heard him mention it on your show, and I was like, I really need to go check that out. So I will definitely do that really soon. Just a little bit behind the curtain here as far as our drafts, everyone. I put together like 10 to 12 names and kind of ranked them in order of when I thought I would pick them or whatever. And so far we have picked numbers 1 through 5. So Richard Bellis was number 5, and Baker was 2, and Broughton was 4. And they weren't really ranked by how good they are. It was just kind of a rough thing. But it's funny, Brett, you're right on track with what I was thinking so far.
Hey, I think great minds think alike, Dan. So I'm glad you have more people to share.
Oh, yes. Okay, so I'm actually going to jump a little bit just because I have a few people that are very Epcot centered, and I want to kind of diversify a bit here. And I want to talk about somebody whose music goes much further back, which is someone who was working a lot on Disney films in the 50s and then went on and did not as many things, but some important things. And that is George Bruns. He is a composer for movies like Sleeping Beauty, 101 Dalmatians, The Jungle Book, Robin Hood, also a tuba player in the Firehouse 5+2. But I promise I won't just read the Wikipedia page. But really, he is known really well for being involved with Yo-Ho, A Pirate's Life for Me, and also some of the other Pirates music in the Q. I think you and I talked about him, Brett, when I was on your podcast to talk about Q music. Just such an important thing there. But also, too, wrote other important elements. He wrote The Nation on Wheels, which is a very familiar music if you have the Disneyland box set, but appeared in Magic Highway, the TV episode, but then also in the Magic Skyway, and then wrote pretty much all the music, or most of it, for the Magic Skyway at the World's Fair. Wrote the Bear Band Serenade with Exitensio. Also wrote the Ballad of Davy Crockett with Tom Blackburn, which is music that shows up a lot of Frontierland area music, Adventureland area music, New Orleans Square, Happy Rag. So basically, this is a guy who, if you talk about just attraction songs, like familiar songs, really only has Pirates, however, has done so much to create the mood and background of Disneyland, especially earlier Disneyland. Like his work is all over, also some Main Street music too, where essentially he's creating original songs that set the mood for Frontierland, Adventureland, Main Street, New Orleans Square, like all of it. And his movie background, I think, makes Disneyland, of course, has a lot in common with movies and how it's set up. I think his movie background was very important in order to then be able to create the right environment.
George Bruns, I feel like, is inextricably linked with Disney music, particularly from the 60s. You mentioned the Nation on Wheels theme, and I was, you may have heard me in the background saying, yeah, because I love that growing up. Mind you, maybe I didn't hear that in person in terms of, riding the People Mover or in Tomorrowland, unless it was in a background loop, but I was so familiar with it in other contexts as well. And Bruns handled 101 Dalmatians from 1961, The Love Bug, The Absent-Minded Professor, so many great films, but also a handful of really notable attractions. So he's a Disney legend as well. I meant to mention earlier that Buddy Baker is an official Disney legend. So is George Bruns, and very deservedly so.
It's good that you mentioned all that too, because the Nation on Wheels is interesting, because I recently was watching Magic Highway, which I don't think I've ever seen before, on YouTube. And I was like, that song is so familiar. Where have I heard it before? And they're like, oh yeah, it's on. Well, there's also the World's Fair box set with all the Magic Skyway music, which if you don't have that is...
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Amazing. That's like a lot of the stuff we're talking about, especially some of the earlier composers, George Bruns and the Sherman Brothers are all over that. And Buddy Baker has had some work on some of the early things that are on there. But basically, he's just had so much from his career that is worth spotlighting. But Brett, let's do it. Let's go on to your fourth pick.
Okay. Well, let's see. I want to also, I feel like we've been talking about some really great composers who have done so much for the park, so much for the company. And I think certainly the quantity of work is definitely there, along with the quality. I also want to highlight someone who's only responsible, to my knowledge, for handling one Disney theme park attraction, but its score is so connected to the attraction that I think it makes the attraction what it is, and that is Jerry Goldsmith handling the score for Soarin' over California. Goldsmith, we know he was an absolute legend in the world of Hollywood film composing. He handled the original Alien, certainly more toward the end of his career, capturing the majesty and epic feelings associated with 1998's Mulan, even handling the Universal Pictures logo that opened every Universal film starting in '97. But it was his score for Soarin' over California at the real tail end of his career that I feel is so not only magnetic, but emotional, that I mentioned how Bruce Broughton's interpretation and arrangement, and ultimately creating his own versions of a few pieces within the score, made me cry. I think Soarin' over California did that for so many folks, and really led me to love the attraction, because if it's not clear already, I love a good Disney park score, and Soarin' in its less than 5 minutes can take us to really amazing places. But it's not just the visuals, it's the audio, it's the use of music. It's just incredible. The main theme tends to feature like dual horn and strings. I think of that initial scene over the river and the people paddling, and we hear some triplets come in. There's fun Western feelings associated with the Anza Borrego Desert State Park scene. It's a score that actually Goldsmith said that if a story serves me right, I think he actually shed some tears after riding the attraction, kind of like some of the guests. And I've seen videos on YouTube of university students performing the Soarin' Over California theme at concerts because it really lends itself well to that setting. It's very much popular in general Disney discourse. And as a musician myself on the side, I don't perform for people, but I perform for myself or any relatives or friends who want to come by. And I had found some sheet music that someone had arranged of the Soarin' Over California theme, and I absolutely love playing it. It takes me to those really enchanting places over different scenery in California. And I really have to credit Jerry Goldsmith for making that attraction even better than what it is, for the notion of being in those hang gliders over a huge projection screen. It's the music that makes it magical.
Totally. Yeah. I definitely had him written down because to me, the score for Soarin' Over California, as far as like an attraction song, is one of my go-tos. I listen to that as much as anything. And also too, I mean, it's easy to look at Soarin'. You can say, oh, well, you're just in front of a screen. What's the big deal? The music and also the wind and movement and everything else. But the music, it makes that attraction. It's one of those where people clapped at the end and it never really, I mean, you could laugh, but it never felt weird because it's like, I would write it over and over. And it's like every time it takes you on this journey. And this is nothing against Bruce Broughton, who did amazing work on Around the World. But for me, the overall attraction, I'm more of a fan of California. One, because it's like it's all filmed. It's not CGI, but also just the music and the film work together so well. And it's one of those attractions where I'm like, this is one of the like perfect theme park attractions for me. The original Soarin' Over California. That's why when they said they were going to bring it back to California, and it was actually still playing there before it closed, and I hope that maybe it'll come back again when Disneyland returns, because part of me really wants to ride that again, and the music is so much a big part of it.
Yeah, you absolutely got that right, Dan. And I think this is a real testament to the power of Soarin's music. If you purchase any soundtrack for Disneyland Resort or Walt Disney World, it's pretty much a safe bet that the Soarin' Over California theme, at least to my knowledge, is on there because it's so reflective of what makes a perfect Disney theme park attraction. So I think that has also contributed to its reach and impact over the years, because it's not just people hearing it in that context, but for anybody who has picked up a CD over the years or downloaded it, it's very much familiar in society, which is, I think, just a wonderful tribute to Jerry Goldsmith many years after his passing.
Yeah, it's one of the great theme park music tracks, and even though that's the only thing he's worked on, he's totally deserving just for that. Well, all right. I'm going to do something kind of similar here with my fourth pick, which is someone who's done a few things, but really it's for one thing. And this is Gavin Greenaway. And this is for Illumination's Reflections of Earth. Now, I know he also wrote the Tapestry of Nations, which that parade has very good music with the hey, 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 that whole part there. And then he also did one at Tokyo Disney Sea that I watched today, this oh my gosh, Bravissimo, which is a nightly water show, which also has good music. But really, I just want to talk about Illuminations, Reflections of Earth, because to me, I am sure Disney is going to pull all the stops out for Harmonious, but it's just hard to top Near Perfection. I mean, it's one of those shows where it's like the music and the fireworks and everything, even the pause in the middle, which I love because it's like, it's basically, the idea of a show that's not just 100 million miles an hour the whole way, that it takes a break. And I know there's a story behind it, but essentially just the music for me, that's another one that I can listen to over and over along with Soarin'. And it takes me through the whole journey of the show, where by the time, I remember there was a few years where I hadn't gone to the park and I went back and saw it. And it's like, I knew the soundtrack so well, but it's completely different to experience it there. Like the show played for such a long time. And to me, it never got old. Like it could have played for the rest of eternity at Epcot and I still would have been okay with it. And I know Disney has to evolve, but I'm just talking me personally. It's just, and then the finale with We Go On, which he also wrote, is just pitch perfect. And that song, again, kind of embodies Epcot to me, even though it started much later in, like 99, but still embodies what I think about when I think about that park. And then, and I don't want to give short shrift to Tapestry of Nations. I'm not sure I ever saw it because it was during the time when I was like in college and then right after where I didn't go to the parks as much before I really picked it up again. But I just, I know that music is very strong, but Illuminations, Reflections of Earth, kind of like Soarin', is one of those just singular Disney, especially when you get beyond like old school Disneyland and early Epcot Center, singular kind of music tracks from the last 20 years.
Oh yeah, Gavin's amazing. I agree. Illuminations is iconic not only because of its grandeur and really illustrating the notion of human connection and really embracing some of the common threads across cultures and spaces, but it's so enticing to listen to because it just gets you so excited. I think, and I spoke with Gavin for an episode of Notably Disney. I guess it must have been early 2020, and I was talking with him and I'm like, Gavin, it's amazing to see a piece of music that's originally used in the Disney theme park actually illustrated in other contexts. So the ABC News theme around the millennium. So, obviously Illuminations, Reflections of Earth around the Millennium Celebration, it was used on ABC News. And that's how I first heard of it and heard it quite frequently. And like, that's pretty just symbolic of how incredible your music is. And it, got an Emmy Award. Gavin's music is just amazing. He's also a spectacular conductor for Disney films like I think Mary Poppins Returns and Solo: A Star Wars Story, among so many others. So very multi-talented guy, and only a few projects in the park setting, but wow, he sure delivered.
All right, Brett, we are up to your fifth pick. This is very important. This could determine if you've chosen a good group. What is your final composer selection?
Oh, okay. So hopefully I'm not being judged. So I was trying to think, kind of like what we were saying earlier, highlighting people that have done so much for the parks and even just a few efforts, but really impactful. So the last individual I'd like to highlight is, and I want to get his name correct, Edo Guidotti. Hopefully I captured the pronunciation quite right there. This is the individual responsible for Spaceship Earth's score from 94 up until 2007. That was before the refurbishment and when later Bruce Broughton handled the new score. But this was the Spaceship Earth that I was introduced to, and it was an attraction that I would ride again and again because not only was I fascinated by the story of human communication and the amazing animatronics and storytelling in play, but also because of the score. And it's a great score that helps me remember an attraction extremely fondly, and one that I listen to even beyond the theme park context. And this score just really kept me riveted because of, like I said, about what Broughton later brought to the attraction with being able to tell a story across different cultures and times and spaces, but also just a high degree of inventiveness. I think back to I can't call it communication scene because that's the whole attraction, but basically I'm thinking of the early 20th century theme where there's almost like a ragtime sentiment to it, which was just very lovable. Also to the tunnel that you would go down toward the end of the attraction, and it was just rapid fire to illustrate, what communication looked like in the digital age, and just the manic but excited energy that just emanated from the score. It's a real masterpiece, and it's one that I revisit quite often. He hasn't really been interviewed all that much to what I've come across. I'd love to talk with him sometime. I know Tammy Tuckey with the Tiara Talk Show interviewed him several years ago. So his work has gotten a little bit of attention here and there, but I'd really like to just honor what he was able to accomplish in making Epcot's most signature attraction even more special through its score, and ultimately one that I think folks need to check out even if they didn't experience it for themselves.
I agree. Yeah, he was listed for me because it's really jarring for me. Like Tomorrow's Child was in the Walter Cronkite version, and I forget how there wasn't that, like there wasn't the same level of a score, like an orchestral score throughout it. So when I listen to or I see the YouTube video, I'm like, whoa, because I'm so used to the Jeremy Irons version and just how much music there was and how music became throughout the attraction such a big important component, and it continued with Bruce Broughton's version, but it changed the entire feeling of the attraction, where it started out as a really good history of communications, and it was very well done. The Cronkite version and the original version are good, but I think one way where they really made it feel more epic, and kind of even the finale, the second half of Spaceship Earth, the best finale, I mean, if you set aside Tomorrow's Child, the best overall finale is in that 94 version, because all the sets and the music really plays in. You come out of it and you're like, oh yeah, the future is going to be amazing. And so that's something that the music really helps with. And I know he also did some work for Delta Dream Flight. There's a little bit of confusion there's two songs and there's two different composers, but I know that he wrote one of the main songs for Delta Dream Flight. But you're right. I heard Tammy's interview and that's how I became familiar with him, but I haven't really seen much else about him. Probably because, again, he worked on only really one or two things, and they were both attractions that aren't here anymore. But great choice, Brett.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad we both agree on him as a really notable composer in the world of Disney theme park music.
Excellent. Well, I have one more pick, and it's tough because I do have some good options, but I'm going to go back to Epcot, and this is someone whose voice you will be familiar with if you listen to a lot of old Epcot music, and it is Bob Moline, who is a singer-songwriter, and you hear his voice on Listen to the Land and on a few others, and also he wrote a lot of them. So just looking at early Epcot, the vibe of early Epcot, I mentioned others, he's kind of the last piece, where Listen to the Land, Energy, You Make the World Go Round, Canada, Your Lifetime Journey, and Golden Dream, written with Randy Bright. All of those were such a key component of opening day Epcot Center, and he was involved with all of them. And again, he's a singer, so he was able to actually be involved singing those. So it's kind of like that kind of down-to-earth charm. He started out with Disney. He wrote an ad jingle for Disneyland and basically got started there. But then when they got towards Epcot, they wanted to, again, build up and have a lot of new music. And he was very involved at that. He also, like I mentioned, he's the other person who did music for Dreamflight. My guess is he did the whimsical song at the beginning of Dreamflight, and that Edo did the song at the end that's more like Epcot-like. But I don't know for sure. I tried to confirm and no one really knew. But regardless, Bob Moline, just a key component, kind of the last missing piece from the other people we talked about, like Buddy Baker and George Wilkins and everyone, of kind of that original Epcot Center.
I quite enjoy those songs as well. I always feel I feel like an honorary Canadian whenever I hear Canada, Your Lifetime Journey, because I feel it makes me feel so proud of what, the individuals who are actual Canadians have been able to accomplish over the centuries. And I think that's the impact of visiting an attraction like that and hearing the song and just feeling extremely attached to it because of the lyrics and the sentiment that comes through. And similarly, Golden Dream obviously has that vibe where It's quite patriotic and really carries on that theme of just really honoring human ingenuity and creativity. So I love those songs, among the others, for those reasons and much more.
Yeah, you mentioned something that makes you tear up earlier. Golden Dream, the last time I was there, I was like, okay, I want to see American Adventure again. I haven't gone in a little while. And it was like 9:30 at night. And I'm watching that final montage and I'm like, oh man, this is really getting to me again. And I'm not somebody who's overly like patriotic in terms of like being sentimental in that way. But sometimes you see all those shots in the end while the music's playing, especially some of the new changes they've put in. And it's just like, oh man, this really hits and shows the power of the music, basically.
Yeah. And, as you're saying that, Dan, it made me kind of draw a parallel. So you talk about with many guests plotting at the end of Soarin', either version. Similarly, I recall being in that space many times with the American Adventure and Golden Dream. For not only is it because it's an amazing production, but because that those last few minutes with hearing Golden Dream, it really captures all that we've been able to accomplish as a nation. Mind you, obviously there have been some harrowing moments, but the notion of really working toward a common good, and hearing clips of JFK and Martin Luther King Jr., among others, in tandem with the lyrics. It's just extremely powerful.
Totally. All right. Well, both of us have great lists. I have a few honorable mentions I want to mention, and I will definitely leave it open if you want to mention anyone else, but I'm going to quickly summarize who we picked so far. Brett, you chose Buddy Baker, Bruce Broughton, Richard Bellis, Jerry Goldsmith, and Edo Guidotti. Great choices. I chose the Sherman Brothers, George Wilkins, George Bruns, Gavin Greenway. Apparently you have to start with G to be on my team. Robert Moline. So I messed it up at the end. But basically, really strong groups. Is there anyone else, Brett, that you would like to mention?
So this is tough, and I know we were both being so careful about how we were sharing our picks throughout this list, because you actually mentioned some people that I may have actually mentioned, but I made some little adjustments. So I think I'm pretty I'm good on my end. I feel like we have certainly highlighted a wide variety of individuals, and certainly I'm sure there are others that haven't crossed my mind, so my apologies to those folks. At all. But ultimately, I'm really glad we're able to spotlight these individuals.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to quickly mention a few others that I wanted. I mean, I could easily go off for 5 minutes each one. John Debney has done a lot of cool things. Phantom Manor, Spectromagic, World of Color Celebrate, so many others, also a lot of movies and TV. So I wanted to give him a mention. James Horner, through his music, he's done a lot of amazing movie scores, but his music for Avatar, he worked with Simon Franklin. Unfortunately, James Horner passed away, but both of them did. I love the Pandora music. I could not get through this without spotlighting it. James Horner also did Captain EO and some music for The Rocketeer, which got played a lot in Epcot. I want to mention Don Harper, who did Rivers of Light and also Epcot Forever, but he did the music for Rivers of Light, which I love. Paul Leonard Morgan did Test Track 2.0, which I love the new test track. Michael Giacchino, the Space Mountain music he did. Phil Collins, I love that Tarzan loop. Just great. And of course, John Williams. I didn't want to just mention the movie guys, but John Williams, so many things he's influenced. And I also want to call out, we have not mentioned one female composer here. And this is not our fault. This is because I literally dug through, and I know there's someone I missed. I apologize. But they just aren't, for theme parks, unfortunately, a lot of the ones we're picking, 60s, 70s, 80s. And unfortunately, this is more symptomatic of the industry than of just Disney. But I do want to spotlight someone who recently composed a new Epcot anthem, which I think is great, which is Pinar Toprak, who also was the composer for Captain Marvel and is a rising star as a composer. But they released this at D23 last year, and I was listening to it today, and I think this is a really powerful piece of music. I hope maybe they can find a way to incorporate this into Harmonious. But this anthem, I feel like, is a step. It's a really powerful piece of music. And also, I hope we are seeing it just in general with composers for Disney and other companies that there's more diversity, because again, that's something that's only going to lead to better music and more variety.
So, Dan, so many things I have to say based on what you just mentioned. One, I want to harken back to something you mentioned a couple minutes ago, John Debney. My apologies to him. I think so so much of him. I had him on my podcast several months ago, but I so closely think of his film music, and his theme park music has also been very rich. A lot of the nighttime shows some international attractions as well, and certainly Giacchino's score for Space Mountain I think of extremely highly. So I'm glad you included those folks, because I think so much of them, I guess I was really more focused on some of these other individuals. But it's so interesting, and I so very much appreciate you talking about just the lack of representation of women and people of color in terms of composing music for the parks. Because I think you're right, that is totally illustrative of film composing and just the industry in general. There's a really dire lack of representation, unfortunately, lack of opportunities in many spaces. And I think Disney, like many other companies, has a real responsibility to ensure that not only the quality is there in terms of who they're enlisting, but also that they're reflective of so many different minoritized communities and communities that haven't been featured in these types of settings. So yeah, that's one thing that actually I had notes on. I didn't necessarily know if there would be an opportunity to fold that into the discussion. So since you introduced that, I just wanted to really highlight that is so important. And I love Pinar Toprok's score for Captain Marvel, and I saw her play that at the 23 Expo in 19, and I was so thrilled for so many reasons, including just the notion of representation. But yeah, Disney has a responsibility to do that. I know I constantly am thinking about that in terms of the people that are being highlighted, because it is a lot of the work being produced is primarily by white males. And I think that there's such a rich diversity of individuals who have done work and will be doing work, but their voices aren't always heard. So thank you for just providing that space. That really made my day. And ultimately, I'm just thrilled that there are so many great composers altogether who have lent their musical voices to Disney theme parks.
Yeah, I feel like when you're trying to choose your favorites from such a large group of people, that I looked at everyone and I thought, man, I hope that if we were doing this same exercise in 5 or 10 years, that it would be different. And I think it will be, but I'm hopeful we're heading in that way. Well, I had prepared, Brett, a few questions about just various things to kind of finish, but this has been rather lengthy. So I'm just going to ask you one of them, if that works for you.
Sure. I'm happy to answer as many as possible, but whatever you'd
we'll
like.
Save them for another time. But okay, so this is pretty simple. We've been talking about parks music, attractions music. I'm curious for you, when you go to the parks, like beyond just what attractions you like to go on, what's something you really like to do at the parks? Like beyond any ride or anything, just or if you haven't gone recently, what do you miss or what do you really enjoy there?
Oh, that's a really big and broad question. I wouldn't have guessed that you were a journalist. Oh my gosh, Dan, tough question. So I'd like to stick around with the theme of music, because I think it's sometimes the unexpected musical opportunities that emerge in the parks that actually are very enjoyable for me. So mind you, I recognize we're in a space right now, particularly with Walt Disney World, where a lot of great cast members and musical acts, unfortunately, aren't there right now. But one aspect of the parks that I love is just, for instance, I think of being on Main Street and hearing, whether it be the Dapper Dans or other folks who just bring so much joy through the Disneyland band. I remember that being a huge mainstay of my childhood in terms of when I would visit the parks, and certainly even thinking of like the Jamators or walking around World Showcase and hearing some unique instruments that I wouldn't have been accustomed to otherwise. It's those moments that obviously they're on the schedule. You can plan for many of those acts, but sometimes they're more unexpected. And I remember when I first heard the Voices of Liberty, and that was kind of my exposure to not only some classic American songs, but also just the notion of a cappella. I love those moments in the parks. They may not get as much attention, but they certainly make them more magical experiences, because I think the thread line here is that music is evocative. It makes us feel very strong feelings because it can take us to different parts of our lives or even expose us to new ideas and themes. So for me, it's those musical acts throughout the parks that are maybe not in a huge theater or get a ton of attention, but ultimately make the Disney theme park experience special.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And for me, like some of my favorite moments might be, especially lately at Disney's Animal Kingdom with some of the entertainment that's been there and Harambe and around, or even World Showcase. There's just something about being in a park, especially at night, and just having like a really good like musical moment and a band playing and everything just really hits. And it's sometimes more powerful. I love attractions, but like you said, sometimes it can be as powerful or even more. So I think that's a great response, Brett. And I think a perfect place to kind of sum everything up. I thought this was a lot of fun. I think your podcast is great. So if listeners want to learn more about your show or connect with you or anything, where should they go?
Absolutely. Well, definitely subscribe to Notably Disney. You can find it wherever you find podcasts. That's Notably Disney. And generally I release 2 episodes a month on the first and third Tuesdays. You might occasionally find some months where I actually release an episode each week. January 2020, that's definitely my intention because there's a lot of great content. So listen to Notably Disney, leave a positive review, add a rating. I'd love to hear your feedback and ideas. Certainly enjoy talking with songwriters, musicians, authors, fellow Disney podcasters, and fans, and everyone in between. You can follow me on Twitter. Just search for my name. It's Brett Ranon. That's my middle name, Ranon, Nachman, Nachman. My handle is bnachmanreports. You can send me an email at notablydisney@gmail.com. And I love to connect with fellow Disney fans and celebrate our love for Disney books and music and everything else. So thank you again, Dan, for having me on. I've always loved your participation and engagement on Notably Disney, and it's been fun to talk about composers here today.
Oh, thank you, Brett. I'm glad that the draft worked out. I usually don't come up with kind of concepts like this, so I think it was great, and you were the right person to know so much about the music. And yeah, I'll make a pitch for your show, which is great. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. It was a blast.
Thanks, Dan.
If you enjoyed this show, I recently did an episode with Tim Grassi where we both came up with creative ways to enhance Walt Disney World. The idea there was budgets would be limited following the pandemic, so what are some ways Disney could enhance the park without spending a fortune? That was really fun. You can find that episode and a lot more by going to tomorrowsociety.com/podcast with an S at the end. You can also subscribe to the show through Apple Podcasts, and while you're there, leave a rating and review, which really helps people to find this show. If you'd like to support the show, like I mentioned at the top of the show, go to tomorrowsociety.com/member. You can get access to some really cool perks, including the monthly Tomorrow Society Bulletin podcast, where in January, I'm going to talk about my thoughts on the end of Magical Express and some of the other changes that Disney has announced recently. I'm surely going to have a lot to say about that. Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I'm going to be talking with author Brian J. Jones once again. Our focus this time is The Mandalorian Season 2. Brian is a big Star Wars fan. He wrote a great biography of George Lucas. So it was really fun to dig into this entire season, spoilers galore, for what's turned out to be a really cool show, and I can't wait for future seasons. Thanks so much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.